enterprisesb.org for more information.
Come to order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on items not on today's agenda, but within the jurisdiction of the committee? Seeing none, let us go to our first item. Mr.
Thank you,
Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. We have two items before you for consideration that we're looking for some guidance and even a recommendation ultimately to council. They're distinct items, but you'll see how they're kind of connected, and we'll go through each one individually, of course. And we'll start with the city administrator's contracting authority. And just to give you some background, the city charter, section 518, does allow council to delegate some of its authority for contracting purposes to the city administrator. And in fact, in 1996, it did so. My guess is that they had some authority before that, but at least in 1996, they established it at $25,000. So for any contract, the city administrator can approve that rather than having to go to council. It applies mostly to professional services agreements because right now the requirement is that if any agreement that goes over $25,000 has to be approved by council. And that's different than when you think about we're purchasing commodities, goods or ordinary services, because if we go through our normal bidding process for those kinds of things, like we're buying widgets or pencils, papers, as long as we follow those bidding procedures, we do not have to go to council, even if it's a $150,000 purchase. And that goes for repairs and maintenance projects. We can have $1 million repair maintenance project, but if it's properly bid, it does not have to go to council. So most of this really applies to professional service agreements. I think on an annual basis, we probably enter into about 200 of those. Some of them go to council, some of them go to the city administrator, and some of them go to the department head because the department head right now has delegated authority up to $10,000. But it does apply to sole source contracts, not very common. Because the sole source contract means we're not following the normal bidding procedures, so they would have to go to council, but they're under the authority that granted to the city administrator. He can approve those as long as they're under $25,000. And emergency purchases and public works contracts currently, if they're under $25,000, theoretically would not have to go to council, but we don't see much of those. So, in fact, I can't remember a public works contract, which is usually major construction, not going to council because it's of the magnitude. So mostly it relates to professional service agreements in this context. So our proposal is to increase the contracting authority from $25,000, what it is today, to $35,000. And this is just really applying the CPI since 1996, which was on a compounded basis was 54.6%. And it gets us right around to $35,000 rounded. And what this means is that if you think about it since 1996, because of the increase in costs and services and the like, that the council has had to approve an increasing number of contracts. And so we're trying to adjust for that. And probably 18 years is too infrequent for us to be coming back to adjust these things, but we thought it was appropriate to adjust that. So our proposal is to increase it by $10,000. And what it does mean is it will reduce the number of contracts that council will have to approve, mostly professional services agreements, and the city administrator will be approving more of those. Obviously, the big dollar contracts, the council's still going to see. So that's the proposal on this piece. And you'll see how the $35,000 number authority relates to our next item, but I wanted just to give you a chance to ask any questions about this first part. And, of course, Jim Armstrong is here to answer any questions.
Mr. White?
Thank you. I didn't understand you said that if the city goes through its customary bidding process, even $1 million contract couldn't go to council.
Right.
Yet we see contracts come forward where it appears that it's gone through the process. I mean, I'm thinking about the bridges. Those are much bigger numbers. But anyway, you'll see that there's been a 1-2 low and et cetera. So could you explain?
Sure, absolutely.
Differentiate between that?
So the only exception to what I just said about the normal bidding procedures has to do with what are defined under state code as a public works contract. A public works contract, by definition, does not involve repairs and maintenance. It's really major improvements to our infrastructure. So a new bridge or a major improvement to a bridge. So anything that is considered a public works contract has to go to council for approval, even though we go through a normal bidding procedure, formal bidding procedure for those, if it exceeds $25,000, and virtually all of them do. But we're talking about repairs and maintenances and purchasing of just goods or commodities in a sense. If we go through a normal bidding procedure, and If it exceeds $25,000, we have to do a formal bidding procedure. If we go through that process, council does not have to approve those. Obviously, the council, in a sense, controls that because it establishes the budget for everything, so it's controlled at that level. But if, as long as there's budget authority and we go through the normal bidding procedures, council does not have to see those.
You know, that just sort of brings to mind the idea that a lot of that repair and maintenance isn't necessarily as visible to the public as it would be otherwise. I don't mean that it all ought to come to the council for some sort of decision, but maybe there's a way, or maybe it is shared with the public through the budget process, you know, all that work. But,
Sure.
you know, it just makes me think that there's a lot of repair and maintenance work
Absolutely.
that is going on all the time that we don't see on council agendas that the public isn't aware of because of that might be useful for people to have and understand, or maybe even kind of help me with the context. You know, is it more than the public works projects, or is it about the same?
Yeah.
You know, is it a quarter of that? It sort of help me with the context
Sure,
of that.
Councilmember Hart. I would say that it's less than the public works contracts, things the council does see. We do include those. So if you look at our annual budget document, we have a listing of all the capital projects. You'll see things as water main replacement program or sewer main. Those are, for the most part, repairs and maintenance contracts, but you'll see what the magnitude that is each year. So you can see that you're, you know, what we're going to be doing, and you're essentially approving those projects, even though when those contracts are let, they're not necessarily coming back to council.
And when we get the quarterly updates on the capital improvement projects, are those rehab things included in that too, or are those more typically the capital?
I'm not sure.
I think most of even the water main replacement, those we treat as public works contracts. When we're talking about repair and maintenance, most of them are more like, painting a building, replacing an air conditioning unit, stuff like that. But the public works type projects, most of them still come to you as a public works project.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
Okay. The next item has to do with what we refer to as the budgetary level of control, and this is applicable to capital projects. Every city has something established as where the council's control is going to be. For the city of Santa Barbara, the charter provides that budgetary level of control is at the department level. And what that means is that any time we change the bottom line of appropriations for our department, the council has to approve it. So if we overspend, or we think we're going to overspend even by $10, we technically have to come back to council to get additional appropriation authority to overspend our department's budget. And obviously, it starts with the adopted budget, and throughout the year, we need more money. We come to council for amendments. So that's where it's established with the city of Santa Barbara. Other cities could have it at the program level. Some smaller cities may have it at a line item level, where council has to approve those kinds of changes. I think at the department level is most common for a city our size. So in the general fund, as you know, we have 13 different departments. There's 12 departments plus the mayor and council's office. And so any time we affect the bottom line of one of those departments, we have to come back to council for approval. But when we talk about other funds outside the general fund, there's a one-to-one relationship between a fund and a department. So, for example, the water fund, that is a single fund, but it's also a single department. It's the Public Works Department, which comprises the entire fund. So effectively, it's controlled at the fund level. So general fund at the department level, which is truly, there are departments, but outside the general fund, the department is really, we're saying it's at the fund level. So you're controlling the water fund at the fund level, and monies can be moved within that fund as long as the bottom line of that fund does not change. The city administrator or department head could change those dollars, move monies around above the line for salaries and benefits or to special projects, supplies and services. Where it's not clear is when we come to capital projects, because we do have individual funds that are made up of a single department that include a number of capital projects. So, for example, in the Water Capital Fund, they may have 10 different projects that you will see in the annual budget that are accounted for in the Water Capital Fund. And if you were to read the language of our charter, the city administrator has the ability to approve monies being moved from one project to another as long as it doesn't affect the bottom line without having council approve that. Does that make sense? We believe that that's not really the intent of the charter, or even the intent of what council may want to be seen. Our current practice is that anytime we see, when we have a material change where a department says, I want to move some money from one project to another, if we consider that to be a material change, we'll bring it to council, and if it's not material, we'll have Jim approve it. If it's very minor, we in finance will approve that. But our current practice is that things that are material do come to council for, and oftentimes you'll see us in our first quarter, second quarter interim statements. We'll see some adjustments, moving money from one project to another, getting your approval. The problem has been that we have not been able to appropriately and maybe to define properly what material means. It's been more of a judgment call. So is it a percentage of the project? Is it a dollar amount? And we thought it was sort of time for us to kind of develop some pretty clear guidelines for the departments and for council so we know exactly when the city administrator can approve things versus when council should be looking at these things. So that's the intent of this proposed policy. So the policy we're proposing is that council's approval will be required under the following circumstances. And the first is if we're creating a new project. So regardless of the amount of money, if we're creating a new project that council has not seen before through the annual budget development process, then we believe that council should approve that. Secondly, if we're moving money from existing projects that council has seen, but that movement of money exceeds $35,000, then we believe council should approve that. And you see the $35,000 ties into what we're proposing for the city administrator's contracting authority. So conversely, if it's under $35,000, then the city administrator would have the authority to approve those kind of changes, as long as, again, it doesn't affect the bottom line. So if we're still affecting the bottom line, council is going to have to approve that. But if we're just moving $25,000 from one project to another, then the city administrator would have the authority to do that. If it exceeds $35,000, then the council would have to approve that. And this is going to apply to capital projects as they're presented in the budget document, because we may have what we consider a program that we show in our capital section of the annual adopted budget. It says maybe the main program, water replacement main program, but within our records, we may keep individual projects and account for individual projects that are part of that overall program. So we may break it down to a more detailed level. Another example is with facilities. Jim Dewey's operation, he may have a category of certain improvements, but within that are smaller projects that he is kind of accounting for and tracking. So we're measuring at the level that council is approving it in the budget document versus how we're accounting for it in detail. So $25,000, $35,000, it's really about how it's presented in the budget document if we're moving money from those categories as you effectively approved through the budget process. So that's what we're proposing, those two resolutions that will be taken to council next week for their approval, and hopefully we'll get a recommendation from the Finance Committee.
Okay, any questions?
No questions, just a comment. I think that's very thoughtful, very well thought out, and appreciated the CPI number that shows the change from 1996 to today and the number that's even less than that, actually. So it makes sense from an administrative standpoint and a policy standpoint, and I think these are good changes.
Mr. White?
I agree.
So for the second policy, does that require a change to the charter?
No. In consultation with Mr. Kalan, as long as we are being more restrictive versus less restrictive, we're okay. So we can provide clarification in more restrictive language through a resolution.
Okay. Very good. All right. In that case, I'd entertain a motion for a recommendation.
The staff recommendation.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Great. Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.